ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned in to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, February 21st, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for joining. Well, war in the Middle East. And, I've tried really hard to avoid it. I've referred to it from time to time on the show, but I haven't really delved into it very deeply. But tonight, I want to spend the show talking about it because there are so many misconceptions out there, and the emerging new peace plan that's being put forward, I think is really problematic. And I think I have a pretty balanced, pretty sensible approach to the whole thing. Look, there's no question that I have a certain partisanship here. I am, for sure, 100% pro-Israel. I don't think there's any question about that. That doesn't surprise anyone. It shouldn't surprise anyone, after all. But I am, for obvious reasons, pro-Israel. And I think that's the right position to take. I don't just think it's, the position I take. I think it's the right position to take. We're going to get into that a little bit. But the point I'm making here, right from the start of the show, is that while I could be accused of being partisan, I don't think that I could be accused of being blind or having my head in the sand or anything like that. So I want you to bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, as we go along. I'm sure that there are things I'm going to say that are going to be difficult for some people, including some people on the pro-Israel side. Okay, so I don't want to be offensive. I'm not planning on being offensive, and I don't think that anything that I have to say should be construed as being offensive or taken that way. But I do know that this is an emotionally charged subject. And so I'm going to go through it, I think, step by step, and I'm like a referee, as I like to say. I call them as I see them, and so I'm going to be critical of one side, but I'm going to be critical of my side if and when I think the need is there. If you want to take part in the conversation, if you want to have your say, I'm all ears. So are the rest of the listeners on our show. You can call toll-free from anywhere in North America. The number is 855-391-3661. The number again, 855-391-3661. Or, alternatively, you can always connect by using your computer audio. And how you do that is you click on, or if you see a link, pardon me, if you see a link in your somewhere along the line that says connect by audio, just use that. But the URL, the browser link is www.callinstudio, all one word. That's callinstudio, all one word, .com/call/JBA. Again, www.callinstudio.com/call/JBA. And if you then call in, you'll be able to use your computer audio for that particular method. Now, just one word of caution: if you're using your computer audio, I'm not 100% sure how your audio on your computer is set up. So if you have a little bit of difficulty connecting when you first call, you'll connect. But you and I may have just a little bit of difficulty speaking with one another because you may have to sort out some settings on your computer. So I've had that problem with a few callers before. So just a little heads up, just a little cautionary note. It's on your end, and if there's a problem with that, and if we could sort it out quickly, great. If not, I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to have to move on. Okay. So, where are we? War in the Middle East. The latest outbreak of war in the Middle East. Now, I hate it when we use this term, war in the Middle East, as if somehow or other the only wars that are going on in the Middle East involve Israel. And I think it's I don't think it's just unfortunate, it's categorically false. So when I talk about war in the Middle East, okay, yes, it's true, I'm referring to Gaza, but I think it's really important to understand that when we talk about fighting in the Middle East, most of the fighting that's going on, and that has been going on for some time, actually doesn't involve Israel. Okay? There's been ongoing fighting between the Houthis in Yemen and the Saudi kingdom, Saudi Arabia. A lot of people don't know that. But the Houthis, before they were shooting missiles at alleged Israel-connected ships in the Red Sea, before they started doing that, they were firing missiles and launching drones attacking oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has been intervening in this civil war. There's a civil war going on, guess where? In Yemen, and the Houthis are on one side of it. And the Houthis are a proxy group belonging to Iran, and the intervention by Saudi Arabia in Yemen has been against the Iranian-backed rebels, and largely because the Iranian-backed rebels, the Houthis, have been firing missiles and launching drones, attacking facilities and sites in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and Iran have been fighting a low-level proxy war in Yemen, in addition to the civil war that's been going on in Yemen in and of itself. So that's one conflict that's going on in the Middle East that nobody's talking about and nobody seems to give a damn about, which frustrates me to no end. Because it sets a context and it drags other countries, and including Israel, in one form or another. And as a consequence of that, I mean, nobody in Israel wants to be fighting these wars or to be involved in this stuff. But everybody's always talking about Israel and the Palestinians. Okay, so, again, war in Yemen. Got that. There is, of course, a brutal, vicious civil war that continues to go on now for the better part of a decade in Syria. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. The Syrians have been slaughtering one another now to the tune of hundreds of thousands of people for the last 10 years. Somehow or other, we've forgotten about that. Somehow or other, when we say war broke out in the Middle East on October the 7th, that's actually not the case. There's been a lot of war going on in the Middle East nonstop for many years. So we have Yemen, and we have Syria. And then, while they're not fighting a civil war in Lebanon anymore, there's still a lot of tension and problems in Lebanon between different factions, political factions, ethnic factions, religious factions. And of course, there's the destabilizing influence of Hezbollah, which is a proxy army, a military or a paramilitary group that has located itself in South Lebanon, that is a proxy of Iran. And the Hezbollah has been, as we all know, targeting Israel from time to time. The fact that they have been firing missiles into Israel since October the 7th is not new. There's been flare-ups, regular flare-ups on the border between Israeli forces and Hezbollah. Sometimes it's a little heated, sometimes it's not, but it's not new. The frequency is greater, obviously. The connection to the war in Gaza, obviously, is new, but the tension and the violence is not new between Hezbollah and Israel. And then, of course, there's the whole ISIS thing and the whole Islamic State thing that is been pretty much suppressed now. Didn't involve Israel, but it's still there. It's still there. And American troops, when we talk about American troops going to the Middle East, American troops didn't suddenly decide, the President of the United States didn't just suddenly decide to send troops to the Middle East after October 7th because somehow or other they want to help Israel. American troops have been stationed in the Middle East for now the better part of a quarter of a century. Okay, so we'll say 21, 22 years. Trump did not withdraw all of the forces, American forces in the Middle East. On the contrary, he kept some forces in the Middle East, particularly to tackle the whole ISIS problem. Now, as I said, ISIS is pretty much suppressed, but they haven't totally gone away. And American forces continue to operate in the Middle East. They have small bases in Syria and in Iraq. And the whole reason that they're there is not to support Israel. It's not to aid and comfort Israel. It's not to intervene on behalf of Israel with Arab governments and with the Arab states. It's because stability and peace in the Middle East is important for the world, for lots of reasons. Now, okay, you could say it's all about oil. You're not entirely wrong if you make that accusation, but oil is important. And nobody's stealing oil from the Middle East, okay? We pay for the oil that we take from the Middle East. Now, we get very little oil from the Middle East here in North America. Very, very little. Okay? But we do get some. And other countries are 100% dependent on Middle East oil. And so the world economy depends on stability and relative peace in the Middle East. Now, again, you can throw stones at the international community and governments and everybody that uses oil and is dependent on oil. And maybe in some utopian world, at some point in time in the future, we'll be able to get off of oil and we'll have reasonably cheap, abundant energy from other sources. But right now, until that happens, we depend on oil, and therefore, it's important to ensure that we have that supply available. And as I said, this isn't a question of exploiting Middle East countries. Nobody's taking anything from them, okay? The countries that purchase oil from oil-producing countries in the Middle East pay cash on the barrel. No pun intended. So there's no exploitation going on here. But as I say, it is true. Yeah, it is true. There is an element of, yeah, okay, we want to have the oil. We want the oil available. So that's important. Now, what else is going on? Well, even internally in Iran, there have been recently a number of bombings that have killed dozens and dozens of people. So there's civil unrest in Iran. There's civil unrest in Pakistan. Now, Iran and Pakistan and Afghanistan, well, Afghanistan, what can you say about Afghanistan? It's just a basket case still. Now, you may say, well, that's not real Middle East. Okay, so let's call it peripheral to the Middle East. But I think, it's important to bear in mind that, again, it's part of that region. And if you want to venture just a little bit north, there's always Turkey. And if there's no civil unrest in Turkey, and there has been from time to time, well, the Turks have no qualms whatsoever about sending in their air force to bomb groups that they consider to be terrorist groups that have set up shop in Iraq or in Syria. So you have the violence that's going on, again, not really high priority, not really, what's the word? I want to say high key. High key is not really low key opposite, but you know what I'm saying. So you have all of these conflicts that are going on, and none of them, ladies and gentlemen, none of these conflicts involve Israel. None of them involve Israel. None of them involve any dispute that Israel is involved in. The Middle East is a basket case. It's a dog's breakfast. And it's a struggle to maintain some degree of peace, some degree of stability in that region. Now, the one country that sticks out like a sore thumb, if you want to use that terminology, in this whole region is Israel. Because Israel is, in the entire region and beyond, the only really real practicing democracy. It's the only country with proper regular free elections. It's the only country with a proper, well-established, liberal, small L liberal judiciary. And it's a thriving economy, probably largely because of those things. Israel, ladies and gentlemen, is not the issue when it comes to Middle East peace. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that Israel is involved in. We all know about the Gaza war. We're going to get to some of this stuff, and we're going to talk about the Palestinians. Don't worry about that. And of course, those subjects directly involve Israel. And I'm not going to say that Israel has been perfectly innocent or is not guilty of making mistakes and doing wrong things along the way. I'm not a mindless partisan. But when it comes to Middle East peace writ large, it's categorically false to say that Israel is at the center of all of this. That somehow or other, if we could only get the Palestinians and the Israelis to come to some sort of an agreement, that's going to bring about peace in the Middle East. And my answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, my response to that is just a fool's gold. That is a fantasy. It's a fantasy because most of the conflict that's going on in the Middle East today does not and never has involved Israel. Most of the threats to Middle East stability don't involve Israel. The ongoing conflict and tension between Arab countries collectively and Iran, which is not an Arab country, by the way. A lot of people don't realize this, but Iran is not an Arab country. And the divisions between Iran and the Arab countries in the region are quite deep, they're profound, and in many cases, they're not reconcilable. They're largely based on ideology, on religious ideology. It's theological differences. And I know we like to think of the human race as having advanced way beyond any kind of religious conflict. But I'm telling you, the conflict between most of the Arab world and Iran is, for the most part, religiously based. So it's not like you just sit down and you negotiate, well, this is where we're going to draw the border. There is no border dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It doesn't exist. And you can't say that the Iranians are somehow or other opposed to Saudi Arabia because of Israel. It just doesn't work. So when we talk about Middle East peace, let's understand that the peace process, You know, perhaps one of the reasons that the peace process, so-called peace process, hasn't worked out so well, that we haven't achieved a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, perhaps it's because everybody that's pushing for a comprehensive peace deal in the Middle East is focused exclusively on Israel and the Palestinians. When in fact, most of the fighting in the Middle East, most of the instability, most of the tensions, most of the hatreds, if you will, don't involve the Jewish state. And frankly, they don't involve the Palestinians either. And nobody should think that all of these other things that are going on in the Middle East that don't involve directly Israel or the Palestinians, that somehow or other those two groups, the Israel and the Palestinians, are not in somehow affected by what goes on around in the Middle East. So, again, when we talk about the Middle East peace process, let's keep in mind that we are not just talking about Israel and the Palestinians. Most of the violence in the Middle East has nothing to do with Israel or the Palestinians or whatever dispute goes on between them. Okay? You got to get that into your heads. A comprehensive peace settlement in the Middle East, I don't know that it's even achievable, given the complexity of the animosities and the competitiveness between various countries, various religious groups, etc. I don't really know that a comprehensive peace deal in the Middle East is even possible. So if we want to talk about a peace process, let's stop talking about the Middle East peace process. You want to talk about a peace process with Israel and the Palestinians? Fine. You want to focus on that? Fine. Okay. But that's not Middle East peace. That's somehow or other mediating an agreement, mediating the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. That's all that is. Nothing more, nothing less. So just a quick reminder, if you don't agree with what I'm saying, or maybe you do agree with what I'm saying, don't be shy. You can always call toll-free North America 855-391-3661. That's the number to call. Or you can use your computer audio, www.callinstudio.com/call/JBA. By the way, it's forward slashes. All right. So what about the fighting between Israel and the Palestinians? Well, okay, I know what the Israelis are going to say. The government in Israel is going to say, well, we're not really fighting the Palestinians, we're fighting Hamas. Okay, that's true as far as it goes. But again, let's not put our heads in the sand. Let's not live in a fantasy world. Let's live in the world the way it really is. The real world the way it really is. And in the real world the way it really is, there is this conflict, this dispute between the Palestinians and the Palestinian Arabs and Israel. Doesn't matter who's to blame. Doesn't matter how it started. We'll talk a little bit about the background after the break. But in the final analysis, okay, you can't deny that there is a group anymore, irrespective of the validity of their historical origins. You can't deny that there's a Palestinian people anymore. Palestinian Arabs, okay? And you can't deny that there's a dispute. So somehow or other, there's got to be some kind of a reconciliation, if you will. There has to be some sort of a modus vivendi. And I think it's possible. I think it's achievable. In fact, I would even argue, and again, we'll get into this in more detail on the other side of the break, but I would even argue that, in fact, and for the most part, Israelis and Palestinians, and by Palestinian, I'm talking about the residents of Judea and Samaria and Gaza, also known as the West Bank and Gaza, whatever terminology you want to use. I don't get caught up too much in the terminology. For the sake of this discussion, let's call it the West Bank. So when I talk about the Palestinians, right now, that's what I'm referring to. Again, not necessarily 100% historically accurate, but I just want to make sure that people understand, what I'm talking about or who I'm talking about. So we'll use that term, Palestinian, when we refer to residents of the West Bank and Gaza. Okay? Again, doesn't matter about the history here. I know we can argue about the legitimacy of the term. Okay, but it's 2024, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? We're not going to turn the clock back and somehow or other come up with a perfect definition of who is from where and who originated where and things like that. That's just not going to happen. The real world, the way it really is, if there's ever going to be a lasting peace agreement, it's got to be based on reality, which I think is my main point. It's sort of a long-winded way of getting to it, okay? But the main point, the main thing that you're going to walk away from this conversation, to take away from this conversation tonight, is that the Middle East peace process, insofar as it focuses on Israel and the Palestinians, that the peace process and the solutions that are being bantered about are not based on reality. And as a consequence of that, they have very little chance of succeeding. That's my teaser. We're going to get into that on the other side of the break, along with some historical context, because I think it's, in order to understand what's going on today, and in order to come up with solutions that are workable today, we have to understand some of the historical context to it. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. These are my sort of introductory remarks. This is me setting the table for a broader discussion on this. And, I apologize. I have to apologize because I think that there probably are a lot of you out there who are going, do we really have to talk about this stuff? Well, if you're American or you're Canadian, there's a certain involvement, especially if you're American. I mean, American taxpayers, Americans are involved. And not just in Israel, as I said, in Gaza, but and the Palestinians, but more broadly involved. So some historical context, okay, some understanding, some discussion around this. And you can't accuse me of having obsessed over this, because while, as I say, I've touched on it a little bit in previous shows, we haven't really delved into it in the kind of detail and length that I intend to continue addressing it tonight. So we're going to go for a break in about 15 or so seconds. When we come back, we're going to talk about the history and how we've gotten to where we are today. Not so much the fighting that's occurring between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, but where the peace process is and how we've gotten here. So we're going to get into a little bit of the history around that. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, just relax, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Bannon Show. All right, we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for February the 21st, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for sticking with the show. Tonight we are talking about conflict and violence in the Middle East. And in the first segment, I started off by explaining that the reality in the Middle East is that most of the conflict, most of the fighting that's going on today, we're very focused on Israel and the Palestinians. That happens from time to time, but the reality is that for the most part, the Palestinians and the Israelis actually don't fight with one another. There's a status quo, a modus vivendi, if you will. I think that if you ask people whether or not they think that, they're satisfied with it, possibly, probably they'll say no. They'd like to see changes to the status quo. I think that everybody likes that idea, not just in the Middle East, not just regards to conflict, but that's the nature of human beings. But for the most part, actually, the reality is that Israelis and Palestinians actually don't fight with one another that much. Again, there are points of conflict. There are issues that are in dispute. And ultimately, it would be a good thing to be able to resolve those problems, resolve those disputes, and maybe even at some point in time formalize whatever the resolution is in some sort of a treaty. But in the meantime, okay, there again, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around this, but there's actually very little fighting that goes on between Israelis and Palestinians. So let's just talk for a minute about that status quo. Okay, set aside Gaza for a moment. Let's talk about the West Bank. Remember, I said we're going to refer to it as the West Bank. I know some people out there are going to go, well, no, it's Judean Samarian. I understand. Yes, that's the Israeli terminology for the territory, but most of the world knows it as the West Bank. So for the sake of clarity, let's refer to the territory tonight in this show. On this discussion, let's refer to it as the West Bank. Most of the West Bank is actually not governed by Israel. Most of the West Bank is governed by the Palestinian Authority. There are 3 zones in the West Bank. There's one zone that's governed exclusively by the Palestinian Authority, including, by the way, their own police forces, etc. Then there's another zone that is jointly administered by the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority. And then there are some pockets, some zones that are predominantly populated by Jews. And these areas continue to be administered exclusively by the State of Israel, by the government in Israel, I should say. And there are problems with that. It was never intended that that would be the final agreement, that that would be the way that things were going to be permanently. But that's the way they are right now. And irrespective of people's dissatisfaction with that status quo in sort of a theoretical framework sense, a big picture sense, on the ground, in the real world, Palestinians go about their lives, Israelis and Jews go about their lives, and whether they like each other or not, whether they would want to see a political solution, again, in the big picture that's different, all of that may be true, but the fact of the matter is that they get along. They work together. They live together. When you go to Israel, and this is particularly the case in Israel, just remember now, when I talk about Palestinians, I'm talking about, as I said, let's be clear, residents of the West Bank or Gaza. I'm not talking about Israeli Arabs. Arabs in Israel are may be, I don't want to get myself into trouble here. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they're ethnically Palestinian. I know, there's no real Palestinian ethnicity. But let's just say, for the sake of, most people would call them Palestinians. But whether you call them Palestinians or not, whether they call themselves Palestinians, the fact is that they're all Israeli citizens. And if you ask them, most of them would say, yeah, I don't want to live in a Palestinian country. I live in Israel. And I'm happy to live in Israel, notwithstanding the fact that there may be issues. Like there are issues in every country. People sometimes don't get along with one another. Groups sometimes don't get along with one another. And some politicians exploit that kind of division. We call it identity politics. Not new, not pretty, not exclusive to Israel. But despite whatever tensions there are, the fact is that most Arabs who are Israeli citizens have no desire whatsoever to be living under the authority of any other country or any other political arrangement. They're happy, thank you very much. And here's something that most people don't understand. I know we veered off a little bit, but indulge me with just for a minute. Most people don't understand this. They don't get this, okay? When Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, the victims of that attack weren't just Jews. There were many Arabs who were victims of that attack as well. And there are many Arabs who serve in the IDF, in the Israel Defense Force. There are many Arabs that serve. And without exception, every Arab that serves in the IDF, now let me correct this. When I said without exception, there is an exception to what I'm going to say. The Druze. Druze is a Muslim sect. They're Arabs and they serve in the IDF. They're conscripted, like the Jewish population, at the request of the leaders of that community. So if you're Druze and you're an Israeli citizen, you'll be drafted into the IDF. You have to serve in the armed forces. And Israel's not the only country this way. Lots of countries have compulsory military service. So, just to correct the record, they would be the exception. But everybody else, every other Arab who serves in the military in Israel, and there are a lot, serve as a volunteer. Now, it would be interesting if there was no conscription in Israel for anybody. It would be interesting to see what proportion of Jews and what would be the proportion of Jews, the ratio of Jews to Arabs who serve in the IDF. Because they have conscription, we don't have that kind of data, but it would be very interesting. So remember, nobody compels Arab citizens of Israel to join the armed forces. But in Gaza, today, now, as we're speaking on this show, Arab Muslim Israelis are fighting against Hamas in Gaza. A little known fact. It's a totally little known fact. And I'm even going to go further than that. Obviously, we all know that Israeli Arabs sit in the Knesset, are members of the Parliament of Israel. Some have served as ministers. A little known fact. Proportionately, there are more Arab doctors, Muslim doctors in Israel than there are Jewish doctors. How does that grab you? Arab Muslims serve as in every field: engineering, medicine, law. There are Arab members of the Supreme Court of Israel. And in fact, at one point in time, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Israel was an Arab Muslim. So I know it's a bit of a digression, but for all the talk about apartheid is pure fiction. It does not exist in Israel. Now, if you want to talk about the division between Palestinians who live in the West Bank or who live in Gaza, okay, is there a separation? Is there a difference? Is the administration of their affairs different? Well, yeah. Yes, because they're not Israelis. It's not a racial thing. It's not a religious thing. It's not an ethnicity thing. The world can't have it both ways. And by the way, the condition of people who live in the West Bank, okay, or Gaza prior to the war, was nothing like blacks living in South Africa. Okay, just as a practical matter. But they also aren't Israeli citizens. And they're not gagging to become Israeli citizens for a lot of complicated reasons. And Israel doesn't necessarily want them to be citizens for a lot of complicated reasons. This is actually at the heart of the dilemma. It's at the heart of what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis, that there are all these complex issues. But as I say, the world can't have its cake and eat it. It can't say Israel should not treat Palestinians in the West Bank differently from Israeli citizens who happen to also be Palestinian Arabs, who happen to be Arabs, I should say. Of course they're going to be, if you live in the West Bank and you want to work in Israel, you have to have a permit. Because you're not an Israeli citizen. Just as if you are Canadian and you want to work in the United States, you have to have a permit to work in the United States. You can't just cross the border and pick up a job. There's a process. That's not apartheid. And if that process were to be eliminated, in order to eliminate that process, they would all have to be Israelis, which means that Israel would have to annex that territory. But the international community says no. And by the way, so do most Israelis. Israel doesn't want to. I mean, you're going to find Israelis that want to annex a territory, but most Israelis don't want to annex the territory. They're going, why do we want to do that? There may be an emotional attachment to that territory. It is the biblical heart. It is the heart of the Jewish nation, Judea and Samaria. But, be that as it may, the reality, again, you got to deal with the reality, the real world the way it really is. And the people who live there, for the most part, are not Jewish. And for the most part, they don't want to live in a Jewish majority state. Okay. So where do you go from here? You know, if there's a real culprit historically, and I hate to say this because I thought the man was a very decent man, but the real culprit in this whole ongoing dispute between Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Israel is King Hussein of Jordan. Because King Hussein of Jordan, okay, after the 1948 War of Independence, the ceasefire, when there was a ceasefire between Jordan and Israel, Jordan being one of the countries that invaded the new state of Israel after that's to say Israel declared independence in 1948, Jordan attacked Israel as one of the countries that attacked Israel. And when they reached a ceasefire agreement in 1949, Jordan had control over most of the territory that originally had been envisioned as a potential Arab state in that section of Palestine. In the territory to the west of the Jordan River, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So Jordan had control of that territory. What is now referred to as the West Bank was under the control of Jordan. And Jordan annexed that territory. And everybody living there were Jordanian citizens. They got Jordanian passports. They got Jordanian citizen papers. They voted in whatever elections, Jordanian elections, existed at the time, between 1948 and 1967. These people were not living in limbo. That area, legitimately or not, that area that we call the West Bank was part of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. And even after the 1967 war, when Israel captured that territory, it's still, much of the civil administration was still controlled, governed by the Kingdom of Jordan. Israel occupied the territory, yes. And Israel insisted on having exclusive control over security arrangements, yes. But Israel did not control the education system, the health system. That was continued to be done by the Jordanian government. King Hussein, after 1967, continued to be the voice of the Palestinian people, the voice of the Jordanian people, because they were Jordanian citizens. Notwithstanding the fact that Israel controlled the territory geographically. Little known fact. King Hussein was the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and any negotiation that was going on for a comprehensive peace settlement involving Israel and its neighbors. Insofar as that territory was concerned, it was the Israelis and the Jordanians that were negotiating. And people there had a life. Not perfect, not at the standard that Israelis live at, but it's not part of Israel. And it wasn't then. So what changed, ladies and gentlemen? Well, what changed is that in July of 1988, King Hussein, in a live broadcast to his people, renounced his and his country's claim over that territory. Now, let me tell you largely why he did it. Largely why he did it was because starting in late 1987 was what we refer to as the First Intifada. The First Intifada was a wave of violence that was being perpetrated by the supporters of Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Arafat and the PLO were not situated in that territory. In fact, they had been expelled from Lebanon in 1982. And they were now situated in Tunisia. And they were going about their business of organizing terrorism and murder and mayhem. But now they were headquartered in Tunisia. And at the behest of Yasser Arafat and the PLO, supporters of his, who were living in the territory, we call it again the West Bank, those occupied quote-unquote territories, launched a campaign of violence. December of 1987. And after 6 months, the King of Jordan had enough. He had enough because there was a lot of pressure on him to relinquish his claim to be the spokesperson on behalf of the Palestinians. And let's remember, this was not just a theoretical thing. The Jordanian government was putting money where its mouth was. The king was putting money where its mouth was. The king and the government under his leadership were continuing to provide services to their Jordanian brothers and sisters who were living in the territory that was currently being occupied by Israel. And they were working on various plans and ideas in order to change the political situation as part of a broader peace agreement. And as it happens, very few people know that King Hussein himself, offered as part of a potential peace agreement, to create some sort of an entity on the West Bank. A permanent entity that was a federation with the rest of Jordan. That came to nothing, but it came to nothing because that was just completely out of step with his friends, with his neighbors in the Arab world, who were very intransigent when it came to this at that time, when it came to dealing with Israel. So the king was under a lot of pressure, but more than that, just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, there was no way that he wanted to have to deal with the PLO anymore. Again, another thing that people don't know is that in 1970, the Jordanian government fought a war with the PLO. At the time, the PLO was headquartered and situated, its paramilitary force was situated in northern Jordan. And they were agitating for overthrowing the king and taking control over Jordan overall. And there was a lot of violence in Jordan. And finally, in 1970, the king had enough, and he fought a brutal war against the PLO and expelled, hundreds were killed, and the remainder of the organization were expelled from Jordan permanently, which is why they ended up in South Lebanon. So you can understand I'm sympathetic to King Hussein, who's basically saying, here we go again. And I'm still getting all of this pressure from my friends in the and neighbors in neighboring Arab countries, other governments. And I'm getting pressure also because, Western countries are falling for this thing that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Why do I need this? So he went on the air in a live broadcast in July of 1988 and announced that the Jordanian government, the Kingdom of Jordan, no longer was executing or exercising any claim over the territory that we know as the West Bank. And there was a practical outcome to that, because not only did he renounce any claims, but they cut off all funding and all administrative support and control over the territory. Wash their hands of it. You guys in the PLO want to be the legitimate sole representative of the Palestinian people. You take care of them. Of course, nobody was prepared for that. And it left a huge gap in administration, etc. So that's part of the history. And as I say, if there's a culprit, as sympathetic as I am, or as empathetic perhaps is probably a more accurate term, as I am to the motivation and the lack of appetite that the Jordanian government had, in particular that King Hussein had. King Hussein's father, King Abdullah, was murdered, assassinated by the PLO. So, I can well understand that he doesn't want to deal with this, okay? So he washed his hands of the whole thing, and he left the Israelis, essentially, holding the bag. That was in 1988. And between 1988 and 1994, with the signing of the Oslo Accords, was the first Intifada, which was a campaign, a terrorist campaign, a relentless, ongoing terrorist campaign directed against Israel, directed against Jewish targets, and eventually, if you want to use the term success in relation to such a campaign, yes, the campaign was successful, because eventually the Israelis had enough of it too. And they came to an agreement with the PLO that saw the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and that saw the installation of Yasser Arafat and the PLO as the governing authority for all intents and purposes in that territory. So that's a little bit of historical context, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk a little bit about the consequences of that particular decision when we come back. We'll be back here, don't go away, on the Joseph Benamy Show in a little more than 2 minutes. And we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for February the 21st, 2024. Notice how I said February, not February. People tend to forget that there's an R in there, February. So the proper pronunciation is February. Sorry to sound so pedantic, but every time I hear people say February, it's February. No, it's February. We should do a whole show on proper pronunciations and proper grammar, and how the English language is becoming bastardized by people who, I don't know, just don't know and don't care. And maybe I care a little excessively about some of this stuff, but it is what it is, right? We're talking about the Middle East peace process, and some of the history around it. And specifically, we've been zeroing in on the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. That is to say, Israel and the residents of the West Bank and Gaza. And again, as I said in the previous segments, when I refer to the West Bank, I'm using that terminology, even though I know a lot of Israelis are going to say, and a lot of members of the Jewish community are going to say, no, can we call it Judea and Samaria? That's their proper names. And I understand that, but I also understand that most people around the world don't refer to it as Judea and Samaria. So even though I would use that terminology normally, I'm not using it in this show because I have a bigger audience than that, and I'm just doing it for the sake of clarity. So I'm not making any kind of a political statement or an ideological statement by referring to the territories of the West Bank. I'm just doing it for practical reasons. So as I said, we've been talking about zeroing in on the ongoing conflict and potential solutions, as we're going to move into, to the conflict between the Palestinians who are resident in the West Bank and Gaza. And we talked a little bit about the historical context and how, we talk about today the two-state solution. Well, the reality was that we'd already had the two-state solution when Jordan was ruling over that territory. It's, when people go, well, we're Palestinian, we want to have independence from Jordan. Well, there was no popular movement for independence from Jordan when Jordan controlled the territory, and they were not ruling it with an iron fist, okay? The Jordanian government is not, a Western liberal democracy like Canada or the United States is, or like Israel is, but insofar as, in contrast or in comparison with the other states in that region, Jordan is a pretty easygoing country and has been really from day one. So, there was a two-state solution. And the reality is that after 1967, if the Jordanian government had just said, we're going to sign a peace treaty, and in return for that peace treaty, Israel is going to withdraw to the 1967 borders, the ceasefire line of 1949, with some minor modifications, okay, that probably would have happened. But it didn't, so, can't turn the clock back. But it is, I think, fascinating to note that we did have the two-state solution. The two-state solution that people are talking about today was a reality. The only difference was that we didn't have a separate Palestinian state. So really, when you think about it in that context, again, as I keep saying, the real world, the way it really is, right? What people are talking about today, they keep on referring to the two-state solution. Really, it's not a two-state solution. It's the three-state solution. Israel, Jordan, and some sort of a new entity. And if it's an independent state, then fine, call it a three-state solution then, because that's what it is, really. It's a three-state solution. Because, it's easy to say, well, Israel but Israel's going to have a border with it. Well, but so is Jordan. So you can't create a new state in the West Bank without the acceptance of Jordan. Jordan has to be a party to that peace agreement because there's a border there, or there would be a border there. And so you'd have to have all of the things that go along with relations between sovereign states would have to be negotiated. So it's not, when people talk about Israel is the chief impediment to a peace treaty, between a peace agreement between the Palestinians and itself, that's pure nonsense. It's a complicated negotiation that involves more than just Israel and whoever is leading and representing the residents of the West Bank. And throw in Gaza, that just adds to the complexity. Okay, I want to talk about how we got from the Oslo Accords to where we are today, and really why the so-called two-state solution, that in reality is a three-state solution, is simply not feasible at the moment. The number to call, by the way, if you want to take part in the conversation, have your say, is anywhere in North America, toll-free, 855-391-3661. As I said, if you have something to say, something to add, you disagree with me, great. Call in, share your views, yell at me, agree with me, okay, whatever you want. So we were tracing the history up until the signing of the Oslo Accords and the installation of Arafat and the PLO as the de facto leaders of this new entity, the Palestinian Authority. I call the Palestinian Authority, I use it in two separate contexts. One is the actual government, and the other is the territory itself that's being governed by the Palestinian leadership. And one of the things that I like to point out is that the peace treaty was not really the Oslo Accords were not really between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They were really between the Israelis and the PLO. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. What I mean is that the Yasser Arafat and the PLO, who were the main interlocutors in the negotiations that led up to the signing of the Oslo Accords, and who were the signatories to the Oslo Accords. Okay. They never lived in the territory of the West Bank. They were living in Tunisia. The Oslo Accords were an agreement that the Israelis signed basically to stop the violence. In a very real sense, for better or for worse, the Israeli government signed these accords under international duress because they were tired of the violence that the PLO was orchestrating. And frankly, so was the rest of the world. And so they basically said, okay, you win. We're going to sign an agreement, and we're going to, as part of this agreement, we are going to have a staged withdrawal of our security forces of the military from different regions in the West Bank, and we're also going to turn over administrative responsibility and control to the Palestinian Authority in stages as well. So, they signed the agreement. The PLO, Yasser Arafat, heroes welcome, situates himself in Ramallah. That's the provisional capital of this new Palestinian entity. Surrounds himself with his PLO cronies. And the Israelis, pursuant to the agreement, they withdraw. And now we're going to sit down and we're going to start talking about what the final status of this territory is going to be. And everybody, whether they like it or not, whether they agree with it or not, everybody understands and accepts that the final status is going to be some sort of an independent Palestinian state, encompassing the West Bank and Gaza. Everybody understood it. Not everybody liked it. Not everybody agreed with it. But everybody understood that that was the direction it was going. That was the assumption. But you have to negotiate where the borders are going to be, how you're going to draw this line, how there are details that need to be discussed. And the big sticking point, ladies and gentlemen, the big sticking point is the status of the city of Jerusalem, which had already been annexed by the Israeli government. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the current state of Jerusalem. Again, you can say it was wrong to allow this to happen. You can throw stones, you can excoriate all of the decision makers that you want, but it doesn't change the reality, for better or for worse. The city of Jerusalem is unified under one government. It was annexed by the state of Israel. But more importantly, as a practical matter, when we talk about East and West Jerusalem, East and West Jerusalem don't really exist cleanly like they used to. Israel has suburbs, and the suburbs of Israel have grown around the city. And I mean, the fact is, East Jerusalem, or what we understand to be East Jerusalem, really is a predominantly Arab enclave that's more in the center of the city. Now, in fairness, I want you to know that I've oversimplified it a little bit. If you look at a map, it's not perfectly like that, but for the most part it is. So there is no chance whatsoever, no chance that the border between a new Palestinian state situated in the West Bank and Israel will be the ceasefire lines of 1949, also known as the pre-1967 line. Nobody is going to return to that line. And there's a reason for that. First of all, the Israeli government is not going to uproot and destroy half of Jerusalem. Now you say, well, all of those people could live in a Palestinian state as citizens of a new Palestinian state. Jews could live there. Except they can't. They can't because the Palestinian Authority doesn't want it. This is the nature of the negotiation that has slowed down and, in fact, undermined the whole move, the momentum towards the creation of a new and independent Palestinian state in the West Bank. It's not Israel. Israel may not have said explicitly, we agree with a new state. But that's the nature of negotiation. despite not having said it explicitly, everybody knew that that was the direction it was going. And everybody knows that if the Oslo process is reinitiated, that's the direction it's going to go. But negotiation implies give and take. It implies compromise. And the negotiating entity that has been inflexible has not been the Israelis. The very fact that there's a negotiation that's going on, or that there was a negotiation that was going on, was proof positive that the Israelis were prepared to negotiate. And not just to negotiate, but there were facts on the ground that demonstrated clearly their willingness to compromise. The withdrawal from parts of the West Bank. The very fact that Yasser Arafat and his PLO cronies have been allowed to situate themselves, install themselves as pashas in Ramallah and the West Bank, and to rule over the Palestinian Authority. All of these things would never have happened if Israel had said no. Israel agreed to these things and facilitated these things. And there were a lot of people, I can tell you at that time, who were saying, this is a mistake. This is a big mistake. But the response to that was, you have to take risks for peace. You have to take risks for peace. And that's not an invalid point of view. So the Israelis did take risks for peace. But the stalled negotiations, the fact that we haven't never achieved the final status agreement that was envisioned as part of the Oslo process, is 100% because the Palestinian leadership, whether it's Yasser Arafat or his successor Mahmoud Abbas, have rejected making compromises. We always hear, Israel has to make tough decisions. But they did make tough decisions. And they've continued to show their willingness to make tough decisions. But the borders are not going to be perfectly like they were in 1962. Largely because the Palestinian leadership itself, the negotiating partners, have made it clear that they do not want any Jewish enclaves in their territory. Well, that just means that you have to expel the Jews. That in itself should be an alarm bell. But the Israeli government is not going to agree to that. The people who live there are not going to agree to it. And let me say a word or two about so-called settlements. I hate the term settlements. There are such things as settlements where you get a group of people, of Jews, who say, we want to create a new town or a village or whatever. So, overnight they come in with trucks and they plant trailers down the ground and they put up some barbed wire. And guess what happens when they do that? The Israeli government goes to court and gets an injunction, and then they send the army in, and the army dismantles the settlements. That's a settlement. And they're not legal, and the Israeli government constantly, regularly dismantles them and arrests people who are doing it. You never hear about that on the news, but that is a fairly regular occurrence. Not every day, not every week, not every month even. But it does happen. The so-called settlements that people refer to that have emerged as an impediment to a peace treaty, and they are an impediment, are not settlements, they're cities with tens of thousands of people living in these neighborhoods, with office buildings, apartment buildings, hospitals, shopping malls, parks. These are not settlements. They're not temporary. They are the natural expansion of an urban area, or of urban areas that occur everywhere in the world. Now, you could say, well, boy, those Israelis were awfully stupid, or maybe they were conniving when they allowed this kind of a construction to go on over the course of the last, okay, let's be clear, 50 some odd years. Okay, this is not something that just happened overnight. You know, at some point in time, you got to ask the people who are living there, you know, you have to sympathize with them, or at least empathize with them. We're not going to allow the city to expand, even though more and more people are living here, and not just through Aliyah, not just through immigration, but the fact that there's an indigenous population that's having babies. The population grows, the city grows. You know, okay, so as I said, the Israeli government was either dumb and stupid, or they were conniving when they approved expansion of the city. But regardless of the motivation, the fact remains that that's the way it is. These are facts, and they're not going to go away. You're not going to wish them away. And so when the Palestinian negotiators say, forget these communities. Okay, let's pretend they don't exist. Let's go to the 1967, pre-1967 war border, which again, remember, was not a negotiated border. It was the lines where the opposing armies were stopped shooting at one another. Okay, in 1949, the ceasefire line. It's ridiculous. So it's the Palestinians themselves who have been told time and again, ladies and gentlemen, time and again, you can have the state. And this is not just theoretical. They were offered in negotiations the so-called two-state solution. But you can't just have the two-state solution. You have to have the practical agreements of how we're going to make a two-state solution work. And the chief, in fact, the exclusive roadblocks to that happening were on the Palestinian side. So all this talk about a two-state solution, okay, it's possible to do, theoretically. It's more complicated than it was before, and we're going to get into that on the other side of the break. I'll explain to you why that is. But it's theoretically, it's a doable thing if the Palestinians themselves stop throwing poison pills into the negotiation and stop insisting that they're never going to compromise on the border. Well, that's not a negotiation. They got everything they wanted. And all that had to be done, and all, frankly, that has to be done, again, theoretically, there are some practical reasons why this is more complicated now, but in theory, all they have to do is say, okay, let's redraw the border. Let's make variations to the 1967 border, pre-war border, that take into account the reality of predominantly of Jerusalem being a single city. And Israelis have said, we'll make territorial changes elsewhere to compensate you for that territory. That's been on the table. And it's the Palestinians that have rejected it. Not the Israelis. It's the Palestinians who have rejected it. This is what makes all of this now resurgent talk about a two-state solution and somehow or other putting the onus on Israel to be more flexible, less intransigent. I don't know how much more flexible you can be than saying yes to the yes. Yes, you can have your state. Okay? Shall we be more? How do you become more flexible than yes? Yes, let's find a way to make it work now. Let's find a way to do it. I mean, where is the intransigence in that? Well, unless you're saying, well, you guys, Israel, you have to eject, you have to ethnically cleanse these regions of Jews, force them out of their homes. Okay. Well, let's say that just for the sake of argument, let's say that that's a possibility. Okay? Well, when we come back from the break, we're going to take a look at what that actually means. Because we don't have to discuss this in theory. We actually have a practical example of what that means in terms of the peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So, stick around, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be back for our final segment in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're back for the final segment, the home stretch of the Joseph Benamy Show for February 21st, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Benamy, and I thank you sincerely for taking the time to tune in and to stay with us. We've been talking about the ongoing conflict, or shall I say conflicts, plural, in the Middle East. And we started out by pointing out the reality that most of the fighting, most of the violence, most of the conflict in the Middle East actually does not involve Israel or the Palestinians and is never going to be resolved by a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So when we talk about the Middle East peace process, people focus exclusively on Israel and its relationship with the Palestinians and more broadly speaking, its relationship with other Arab countries. But the fact is that Israel is not involved in most of the conflict that is occurring right now in the Middle East. And insofar as Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors is concerned, really the peace process consists only of finding some kind of a way of formalizing what really is just already a status quo, a modus vivendi between the states. I think that Israel would like to have formal relations, a formal agreement with its Arab neighbors, but for the most part, it doesn't really matter. Okay, the number to call, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to have your say in this last segment of the show, the last half hour of this week's show, you can do so by calling toll-free anywhere in North America, 855-391-3661. The number again, 855-391-3661. Or you can call using your computer audio if you're catching the show on the computer by going to www.callinstudio, all one word. That's callinstudio.com/call/JBA. And you will be connected to the show live using your computer audio. Word of caution, if you're going to do it that way, though, I cannot speak for the settings on your computer. So you may find that while you can connect, you may have to make a few adjustments to the settings on your computer in order to be heard. Now, we can deal with that if necessary when the time comes, so don't worry about it. I'm a patient person, and I know my listeners are all patient, and they're prepared to take 10 or 15 seconds to make whatever adjustments to your system settings are necessary, and I'm happy to help you do that if it happens, if it's necessary. Okay, so as I say, we've been talking about the war in the Middle East, or ongoing violence in the Middle East, and then we sort of focused on the fighting between Gaza, or fighting between Israelis and Palestinians over a period of time. And as I said, in terms of the relationship between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, there is a modus vivendi, status quo, which is actually pretty stable and pretty peaceful. You know, people can get along without actually signing a declaration that they're going to get along. I don't sign a declaration that in order to get along with my neighbors. It's not always necessary to have that formal piece of paper. And insofar as relations between Israelis and Palestinians, and when I say Palestinians, let me reiterate, I'm talking about residents of the West Bank and residents of Gaza. Over for the last 30 some odd years, 40 years or more, people have managed to find ways to work together in peace and to be in a mutually beneficial relationship. It seems to be that it's only when the international community sticks its nose into the situation and tries to force people to come up with a formal agreement, there's my air quotes that you can't see, a formal agreement, okay, that's where the trouble starts. And I have to tell you, here we are again now talking about this so-called two-state solution. Now, you know, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, when I look at the demographics, when I look at the demographic distribution when I look at the birth rates, when I look at everything, I confess to you, it's difficult for me to envision a long-term agreement, a long-term solution that does not include some kind of a new Palestinian entity, call it a state, whatever, in the West Bank and in Gaza as well. Ultimately. And as I've said, I think that most Israelis would agree with that, even if they don't like it. But now is not the time to be talking about this. The reason that we haven't done it yet, the reason that an agreement of that nature doesn't exist yet, is not because of Israeli intransigence. It's because of the intransigence of the Palestinian leadership. They are the ones that have said no to the two-state solution, except under their terms, which do not include a negotiated boundary and negotiated borders. And so the Israelis would be crazy to agree to the kind of conditions for the establishment of a Palestinian state that are being put forward by the Palestinian leadership. It's never going to happen. People have to get that. Lord Cameron, if you're listening to the show, get it into your head. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen ever. Because the two-state solution is not going to happen as long as the Palestinians leadership continues to be as intransigent and as inflexible and unwilling to negotiate the final status as they have been. It's just not going to happen as a practical matter. But more importantly, why? And this I have to say is I'm flabbergasted to the point of being almost speechless, and emphasize almost speechless, at the audacity of Lord Cameron to somehow or other call on the international community to recognize an as yet non-existent Palestinian state, irrespective of the position of Israel in these negotiations, and to say that this is a way of putting pressure on Israel to accept it. That's frankly, I'm struggling to find the right words for that. I mean, it's when the Prime Minister of Israel talked about, negotiating with Hamas for the release of hostages, and he talked about delusional demands in the negotiation, he could just as easily have been talking about David Cameron. And there's a subject for a separate show. I can't help but make the observation that here's somebody who has been resurrected from the political death that he suffered. I mean, there's a reason why he's Lord Cameron, because he had to resign as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister at the time. He's a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And his political career was, for all intents and purposes, over. That's what they do with politicians whose careers are over. They give them a peerage and they end up sitting in Parliament in the House of Lords. Look, don't get me wrong, they still do good work, but a foreign secretary? I mean, this man's political career has been resurrected for some reason, and I really don't know why. But for him to have the audacity and I'm surprised because, I've always liked and respected David Cameron. Don't always agree with him over the years, but I'm just astonished at the claptrap that's coming out of his mouth on this subject. The international community should recognize unilaterally an independent Palestinian state. I mean, what are the consequences of that? Does Lord Cameron think that Israel is just going to go, especially today, is going to go, oh, well, in that case, we might as well just knuckle under? And it's never going to happen. But I'll tell you what will happen is if countries follow through with this, and I'm deeply troubled to hear our government here in Canada and the American government, not talk so much, they're not talking about unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, but they are talking again about two-state solution. Israel has to understand they've got to make difficult choices. Two-state solution. Okay, so we have to delve back into a little bit of really important history here, because before the break I said, we don't have to examine this idea of unilateral withdrawal and granting a state. We don't have to look at this in theory. We have a practical example. The practical example is Gaza. Because in 2005, again, largely under international pressure, the government of Israel, under the leadership of Ariel Sharon, no less, agreed to withdraw unilaterally from the Gaza Strip and to forcibly evacuate Jews who were living there. Essentially to ethnically cleanse. And yes, that is the only term that we can use, ladies and gentlemen. That the Israeli government ethnically cleansed Gaza under the leadership of Ariel Sharon of Jews. There's no other way of describing it. That's what happened. So Israel forces all of the Jews, all Israeli citizens, to leave Gaza. And it withdraws all of its own forces from Gaza in 2005. Hands it over, lock, stock, and barrel, to the Palestinian Authority. What happened? Well, for starters, this didn't help advance. Nobody gave Israel any kind of credit for the quote-unquote tough decisions that they were making in pursuit of a peace agreement. No credit was given to them, just more demands. And I want to say that the Palestinian Authority dropped the ball when it came to Gaza. And they absolutely did. And of course, within a year, Hamas takes over the territory, essentially purge violently, brutally, any opposition, and become essentially the dictatorship over Gaza. That was 18 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. That was the result. But what bothers me the most, and I don't hear, unfortunately, I don't hear many Israelis talking about this, but I think it really does need to be talked about. It's easy to say the Palestinian Authority fell down on the... I didn't expect anything from the Palestinian Authority. The fact is that Yasser Arafat and now Mahmoud Abbas and the whole PLO, that whole gang are singularly unqualified to govern anything. no government experience, no administrative experience. Okay, the legacy of the Palestinian Authority has been one of corruption and ineptitude. And who could have expected anything more in 1994, when Israel signed onto the Oslo Accords? This was precisely what people like me were predicting would happen. Everything that we said were going to happen as a consequence of this bad process and the bad deals that were being made and the bad decisions that were being made, every single thing has come to pass. So throw stones at the Palestinian Authority. They're behaving exactly the way, again, people like me expected them to behave. They have been as effective or ineffective as people like me predicted they would be. No surprises there. What is a big disappointment, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that nobody is recognizing the culpability of the international community over what occurred in Gaza, because there were guarantees, promises, commitments that were made by the international community to invest in this territory. Now, in fairness, because I like to always be fair, some investment did occur. But of course, the place is rife with corruption, and Hamas has only made the situation worse. But if there's going to be a solution in Gaza, after the fighting stops, this current round of fighting, it's only going to happen if the international community stops pontificating and starts rolling up its sleeves and getting involved in a real way. And by that I mean, please, please God, no United Nations. Please. Can we keep the United Nations away from post-war Gaza, post-Hamas Gaza? The United Nations has been an abject failure, a disaster when it comes to ending conflict or preventing conflict. Look at Lebanon. People forget that there's a military force, a United Nations military force. It's called UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. Was set up by the United Nations in 1978 to police southern Lebanon, to ensure, in the first instance, that the PLO would not gain control over that territory and use it as a launching pad for attacks against Israel, which it did. And again, in 1982, after having to fight another war because of the failure of the United Nations and the international community to follow through with its commitments, its security guarantees, Israel fights a second war in southern Lebanon. And, in 1982 and 1983, when they withdrew as part of the ceasefire agreement, and Yasser Arafat and the PLO, they get expelled from Lebanon. Now they go over to Tunisia to start everything that they were doing in southern Lebanon from Tunisia now. That's where they're orchestrating their worldwide campaign of violence. That's the new headquarters. And in return for letting them go, the United States and France in particular provided security guarantees to help pacify and restore stability to Lebanon. And in 1983, this new group called Hezbollah committed suicide bombings against the American Marine barracks in Beirut and against the French, and both the French and the Americans ignoring the security guarantees that they had made, on which Israel was depending turned tail and ran. Sorry, I hate to say it, but I just don't see any other way of describing it. And so, again, Israel, despite the fact that the international community has given its guarantees, they simply don't follow through. UNIFIL, that continues to exist in 1982 and 1983, does nothing to prevent Hezbollah from entering into and setting up shop in South Lebanon, and to use it as a stage for attacks against Israel. And of course, Israel fought a war in South Lebanon subsequent to that as well, and the same cycle. Ceasefire, agreement that Hezbollah is not going to return to South Lebanon. Israel withdraws its forces pursuant to the agreement, vacates this territory, and Hezbollah ignores its agreement, moves back into this territory, starts using it as a staging area against Israel. And the United Nations and the international community does nothing. So the reason I say this is because the number one problem for Israel, if you want Israel on side, and they want to be on side, you have to deal with ultimately the trust factor. And the Israelis don't just distrust, for very good reason, the Palestinian leadership, because, you know, when we talk about Palestinian leadership and transigence, let's not forget that after they were, again, offered this two-state solution with negotiated borders, which was unacceptable to them, that we should negotiate what the borders are going to be, they launched what became known as the Second Intifada. And who could forget the enduring images of what that meant? Bombed buses, innocent men, women, and children, almost on a weekly basis, slaughtered in the hundreds in Israel. That was the response. That was how the Palestinian Authority negotiated. And if you think that that's already ancient history because we're talking, 15, 20 years ago or thereabouts, let me remind you that when a Palestinian commits an act of terror today, ladies and gentlemen, today, in 2024, if they're killed in the act or if they go to jail, the Palestinian Authority pays an extra pension to the family of that terrorist as a reward for having raised a quote-unquote martyr. Let me repeat that. When little Sammy goes on a rampage in Jerusalem, stabbing students at a school and killing 6 or 7 of them or more, and injuring more. And if little Sammy, in the course of this rampage, is killed by the police, the Palestinian Authority awards the family, the parents of Sammy, with a lifelong extra pension as a thank you. How do you trust that, ladies and gentlemen? These are the things that have to be dealt with. And then along comes David Cameron, Lord Cameron, and he has the chutzpah, the unmitigated gall, to suggest that the only way to get Israel to agree to a Palestinian state in the West Bank is if the international community unilaterally recognizes that state, despite the fact that as a practical matter it doesn't exist. That's how we're going to put pressure on Israel. As if Israel is the the reason why we're here today. Well, okay, let me make a concession to the haters out there. You're right. Israel is the reason we're here today, but only to the extent that it exists. If Israel didn't exist, we wouldn't have all of this conflict. At least not with Israel. Of course, Saudis would still be fighting Houthis. Syrians would still be fighting Syrians. Lebanon would still be a basket case. Iraq, what can I say about Iraq? Afghanistan, Pakistan, violence in the Horn of Africa. All of these things would still be going on. Nothing whatsoever to do with the Jewish state. So, you're right. If only Israel didn't exist, we wouldn't have this conflict between Israel and other entities. But it does exist, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not going anywhere. Okay, I think I've had my say tonight. I've had my fill of it. I'm sure you've had your fill as well. I don't intend to return to this subject again in anywhere near as much detail because, as important as it is, I'm kind of bored with it. And there are other, I think, very important subjects that need to be addressed as we move forward. So I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in this week. As always, you can catch this show and an archive of other shows by going to josephbenamy.com. That's all one word, Joseph Benamy, without the hyphen.com. You can check out the Joseph Benamy Show drop-down menu. You can then watch the Catch the Show podcast there or on any of the other podcast platforms. And by the way, while I'm leaving you here, please follow me on X, formerly Twitter. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much. Appreciate it. We'll catch you again next week here on the Joseph Benamy Show.